These new tactiles from KTT are very unique. The Monochrome Onyx is one of 3 switches in the monochrome line that's produced by KTT in collaboration with dangkeebs, which is a small vendor out of Las Vegas, Nevada. By lurking on his Reddit history, I discovered that dangkeebs got their start as a vendor by ordering 4,000 Gatoron yellows and slinging them on Mech Market. Since they officially launched in late 2020, they've run several successful group buys and have quickly built a reputation as a solid vendor in the hobby. One thing I really appreciate about their site is their search function, which lets you filter searches by type, housing material, and stem material, which I haven't seen any other vendors do, so I thought it was worth pointing out. Now, I always try to do a quick background on the manufacturer if they're new to the channel. So who exactly is KTT? They don't have a Western website, but based on this Thermangoat review of the KTT Strawberry switch, they came onto the scene in late 2020 out of China and became known for selling budget switches that punch way above their price point. Fun fact, KTT apparently stands for Kangteng, which translates into content. Getting back to the content at hand, the monochrome line includes the chalk linear, the marble medium tactile, and these bad boys, the Onyx. I classify the Onyx as a hyper-tactile switch that's made of a full polycarbonate housing with a palm stem and a 22mm long spring. So if there are no fancy materials, what makes this switch so unique? 2 words. Plateau tactility. They're marketed as having a sharp plateau bump, but what the heck is a plateau bump? Let's take a listen to these switches stock right after you click the plateau. That's the like button. I describe the type feel of these switches as having minimal pre-travel that rounds into what feels almost like 2 tactile events with what feels like more than 1mm of post-travel. If we take a closer look at the stem, we can see the flat edge on the leg before actuation, and it leads to the illusion of a large but rounded tactile bump. Normally, rounded and sharp are the 2 different ways I describe tactility, but somehow the design of the stem on these switches makes them feel like it's a large, rounded entry that drops off very sharply into actuation. Like I said, they're pretty unique in that feeling, although in practice they feel pretty similar to a lot of other mid to very tactile switches like the Boba U4Ts and the Anubis. The initial bump combined with the ramp, or the plateau that immediately follows it, almost amplifies the tactility, and the long spring leads to a pretty snappy return. I have to say, if you're looking for some very tactile switches, these are a great option. As for the sound, they're definitely on the clackier side, which is to be expected given the full polycarbonate housing, but they aren't excessively bright sounding. I could see these switches sounding really good and neutral with a set of PBT keycaps. On a side note, I always use GMK keycaps in my reviews, but let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in me adding a quick sound test with PBT keycaps moving forward, as I do feel that PBT keycaps have come a long way in both quality and availability with all the in-stock options available these days. Now let's talk about modding the switches. As far as I could tell, the Onyx switches come without any factory lube, but are totally usable stock with none of the crap sounds, meaning crunch, rattle, and ping, that would require modding. I did hear a tiny bit of ticking that's going to be present in pretty much all tactile switches, but it wasn't too bothersome in regular typing. That being said, I lubed some switches with Tribosis 3203 and filmed with Deskey's films. Let's take a listen after the mods, as well as a comparison with some other popular tactile switches. Comparing the stock to the modded switch, the lubed switch was a little smoother and sounded just a little more refined to my ears, although I'm not sure how well that translates over YouTube. I'd say it's definitely worth lubing the switches for peak performance, although it's definitely not necessary, and I'd say these are totally usable stock. As for filming the switches, I personally don't think it's worth it. The sound got a little louder, as had been the trend with these tighter tolerance switches being released these days, and it introduced some of the mysterious ticking noise that wasn't there in the stock or lube switches. The Onyx switches also have the bar on the top housing that we've seen on several other switches where I didn't recommend filming, but your results may vary. Compared to all the other switches we tried today, the Onyx switches were among the most tactile feeling. Although when it comes to tactility, it's hard to say one switch is more tactile than another due to the difference in spring weights and the type of tactility that the different switches have. I'll say that the plateau tactility of the Onyx switches, combined with the long post travel, makes them feel pretty unique. One thing I was concerned about, considering how tactile these switches are, was the possible effect on my typing speed. However, I was able to average around 117 words per minute on monkey type, which isn't too far off my average of 120 words per minute. I also didn't find these switches fatiguing to use in a 2-minute typing test, probably due to the 50-gram bottom mount spring. That being said, it's time for the good, the bad, and the ugly. First, the good. There's a lot to like about these switches if you're looking for a very tactile switch. They're ready to go stock, and they only get better with a little bit of lube. Another great thing about these switches is the price. At just under 44 cents per switch with code MAKER, these switches are priced very competitively, and I can't say that I can think of any other tactiles that are better at this price, or even at 20 cents more per switch. The price to performance of these switches makes me really excited to try other KTT switches because they really punch above their price point. As for the bad, I'm starting to reevaluate whether an issue that I see constantly can really be considered an objective bad, but I'll still note any issues I see in this section for full transparency. Like with most, if not all tactile switches, the friction between the tactile leg and the tactile leaf causes ticking, and these switches aren't completely immune from ticking. However, it's really not too bad on these switches, especially compared to how tactile they feel. Now for the ugly, or I guess I should say the nice to haves. I'd like to have seen these switches in a different housing material, only because I'm not a huge fan of how polycarbonate sounds. It's got that higher pitched sound signature. That being said, polycarbonate is also quite a bit smoother than a plastic like nylon, so it seems like a conscious design decision to prioritize smoothness over acoustics, which makes sense because acoustics are subjective while smoothness is very much an objective standard for switches. This being the first KTT switch I've really tested, I'm interested to see what their factory lube is like, so if you've tried their factory lube switches, please let me know in the comments. The bottom line is, these switches would be a great value at 20 cents more per switch. And if you're looking for an extremely tactile switch with a light spring, you should definitely check these out. Just like you should check out this switch review here. I'm MakerMods, and I'll catch you in the next video.